Hey guys, we'll get started in just a moment. Oh, here we go. Oh. Let's see if this worked. There you are, Joshua.
How are you?
I'm good. How's it going?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. It's a little pixelated, but let's see. Shoot, the connection's not great. Joshua, do you want to try logging out and coming back in? And could be a connection issue. Oh, okay. Thanks everyone for your patience. We're having some technological difficulties, but Joshua will be joining soon. Here we go. There we go.
Okay.
A little more,
Sorry.
yeah, this is better, I think.
Okay. Let me just
Cool.
make sure. All right.
Well, thanks everyone. Sorry for the delay. For those of you who are new here or just dropping by, my name's Nancy. I'm one of the co-founders at Bookclubs. We are a web and mobile app that makes organizing and starting a book club super simple. And our mission is to inspire meaningful connections through reading and discussion, which is why we host this monthly mini book club with one of our partnered authors. And this month, we are chatting with Joshua Henkin, the author of Morningside Heights. Joshua, if it's okay with you, I'm going to read a little bit more about you and your background before we dive into questions.
Of course.
Joshua Henkin's new novel, Morningside Heights, was published in June and was named an Editor's Choice book by the New York Times. Henkin is also the author of the novels Swimming Across the Hudson, a Los Angeles Times notable book, Matrimony, a New York Times notable book, and The World Without You, which was named an Editor's Choice book by the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune, and was the winner of the 2012 Edward Lewis Wallet Award for Jewish American Fiction, and a finalist for the 2012 National Jewish Book Award. Joshua lives with his wife and daughters in Brooklyn and directs and teaches in the MFA program in fiction writing at Brooklyn College. So Joshua, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And for those that might just be lucky in catching this on their lunch break, I'll share a little bit of a synopsis of the book without any spoilers, of course, and then we'll dive into some specifics. So this is the beautiful novel, Morningside Heights. I had the pleasure of finishing it just a few days ago. And it is the story about a marriage and family surviving hardship, how love endures and changes during tumultuous times. The lead character is Spence Robin. He's a brilliant professor, and he has been diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. And the story is not so much about Spence and his relationship to this debilitating disease, but rather the people, the community, the structures around him, and how they are forced to contend with a curveball, if you will, a big one. So hopefully that was a good overview of the story, Joshua. It's hard to do it in just a few sentences because it really is a very rich and beautiful novel.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really happy to be talking to everyone. I'm glad to have you summarizing instead of me, because it's always hard to summarize a novel.
Yeah, it is, and especially without wanting to give away too much. But I think a good place to start actually is inspiration. And, you know, this is your fourth novel, and your other novels, some of them do tackle grief and through the lens of a marriage. And I'm curious what compelled you to tell this story of marriage and grief, and how it was maybe different from your previous novels, and ultimately what inspired you.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I like to write about family. I'm interested in relationships over the long haul, and I'm interested in sort of, making characters jump off the page. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to write about characters over many years. And family is so central for all of us, since that families are so complicated. This particular novel really grows out of my own family's experience. So my father, like Spence, was a well-known professor at Columbia who got Alzheimer's. Fortunately, got it much later in life than Spence did. He got it in his late 80s, but he was still teaching at Columbia at the time, which is the story in its own right.
Yeah.
But in some ways, as you were saying, I was less interested in Spence's experience than I was in the characters around him. And so in some ways, the book is really Prue's book, his wife's book. And Prue is inspired in some way by my mother's experience when my father had Alzheimer's, because when my father was sick, my mother signed up to join a class at the Jewish Community Center in Manhattan for caregivers. And I was surprised by this, because my mother is very much not a consorting with strangers kind of person, not a self-help group kind of person. And I was interested in what had happened for her, that she would take comfort in the company of people whom she might not have had that much in common with, aside from the fact that they were all caregivers. And so the book started out as a long, short story that took place really around the JCC, between Prue and the people she meets there. And, I worked on the book for 8 years, and I wrote 3,000 pages. Only 10% of what I wrote is still in the book. And probably around draft 7 or 8, I realized that I wasn't really interested principally in the JCC. And then what I was really interested in was this marriage and this family over the long haul. And so by the time the book was done, the JCC was completely gone. Although Walter, a character who remains essential to the novel, was originally in the JCC draft, and I got him into the book through another avenue.
Okay. One thing you said that I have to ask, only 10% of what you wrote is actually in the novel. What is that like as a writer? Surely they're not wasted words by any means, but that seems like, as somebody who's never written a novel, that would be, I don't know, maybe frustrating, or like, oh, or maybe it's just part of the process. I'm curious.
Yeah, I think it depends on how you go about the process, and it depends on your temperament. For me, it's not frustrating at all. There are lots of things about writing fiction that are frustrating. It's really hard to do. That's why it takes 8 years to write a book for me. But there's nothing I like more than throwing out stuff and tightening. And I agree that, none of it is wasted, in the sense that people will say, well, I feel like I have to bark up a lot of wrong trees to get to the right tree. And people will say, well, don't you wish you got to the right tree originally? But I feel like it's not possible to get to the right tree originally. And the way to discover your characters and make complicated characters is to make a lot of mistakes along the way. I teach fiction writing, and I will often say to my graduate students, I ask them a series of questions about their characters, because I feel like you don't really know your characters well enough. And if they're particularly defensive, as they sometimes are, they'll say, well, I don't know why that has to be in the story. And the answer is that it doesn't have to be in the story. But if you know your characters well enough, then that knowledge, even if it's not explicit in the novel, will come through. So it's like Hemingway's tip of the iceberg. So I feel like all those thrown out pages are investments in making the pages that stay be the right pages, the ones that really get our readers to know character.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And 8 years, spending 8 years with these characters, Prue, Arlo, Jenny, we're only getting a glimpse of them. I'm sure there are even more layers there that I would be so curious to learn more about. That's always the hardest thing about finishing a novel that is so rich with characters, is you miss them in some ways. And I'm sure as a writer, when you finish this huge project, for lack of a better word, it's probably hard to say goodbye to these characters that you've lived with for 8 years.
in some ways, in
Or
some
maybe you're
ways,
tired of them and you're like, done.
well, I mean, it's like, for the reader, hopefully doesn't take them 8 years to read the book. So they're entitled to miss them afterwards. And my hope is they will miss them afterwards. But I feel like for the writer, the goal is to get to be so sick of them that you want to move on to
Yeah.
another project. So, I mean, certainly when you finish a book, it can be hard. You don't know quite what to do with yourself. But by the time I was done, I was ready to move on to another book.
Yeah. Fair enough. Well, I wanted to go a little bit deeper on something you said, that you are drawn to the long haul, and characters that are in things, and arguably the commitment of marriage is there's no better example of a long haul. And let's say this book was required reading for a couple embarking on marriage. What new perspective do you think that they would gain from this book on marriage?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's hard to know just because I'm really committed to the idea that fiction is about the particular, not about the general. And so I kind of feel like there are no takeaways from a good novel. Is kind of what I mean. I feel like, politicians and priests and rabbis and philosophers live in the world of takeaways, and novelists live in the world of characters. So I see my job as trying to create flesh and blood characters and getting them into trouble. And so I'm really resistant to the idea that there's a lesson in the book. But I guess, as in any book that covers many years, no one knows what the future holds. And so no one who gets married, I mean, there are always surprises. Good surprises, bad surprises, surprises that are neither good nor bad, but are interesting. So, but I guess, I mean, I would think that most people who've lived long enough would discover that without the help of my book. But maybe not. But I'm really a firm believer that fiction is not about teaching lessons. It's really about just transporting the reader. Making them, as you say, Nancy, miss the characters. That's what you want at the end of the book. Nothing more, nothing less.
Yeah. You're making me wish I could be a student in your classroom. I love the way you describing all of this, and I think if I was a budding writer, these would be really great points about the type of story that is going to leave a mark on people, with not the aim to teach anything, but to tell a good, compelling story. So I'm jumping a little bit around because I think you talked about just being prepared or unprepared, and in a marriage, there are things that happen that you don't anticipate, and that's life. And in the backdrop of this story of Prue and Spence and his son and daughter, they're living in New York, and it sounds like you've grown up in New York and currently live in New York. But I do think there's something special about this being in New York. So I read an article in the New York Times about this book, and the journalist opened the article by saying, for a certain species of novel, only a self-identified New Yorker is truly the cert reader. And I know that's a Yiddish word, so I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it. But I think that means soulmate, the cert. Is that correct?
Basically, yeah. Basically.
Okay. I loved that because, well, I cannot not claim that I am a New Yorker by any means. I did live in New York, and I lived in the Lower East Side, and I'm no longer there. And when I read this book, I was so sad that I couldn't be standing waiting for the F train, or in Kozar's Bagel Shop. And there's something super unique and special about inhabiting the same spaces that your characters are at the same time. But I think what's so unique about New York is it's the New York of today is not the New York of tomorrow. It's your days are ruled by uncertainty in comparison to maybe the predictability of suburbia. And I'm curious if you always knew you would end the last scene of the book with Prue, Spence's wife, walking down 59th Street and kind of making these observations about the storefronts changing. And it seemed to me this very typical, and I use that word in a great way, a typical New York moment. And I just found that to be an interesting parallel to a story about dealing with uncertainty in a city that is certainly always undergoing uncertainty. So I wanted to ask you that, and then more broadly, just what that city has meant to you as a writer and how it's impacted you.
Sure. So in terms of did I always know? No, I didn't always know anything in this book. And I mean, that was why I wrote 3,000 pages. I'm a deep believer in not planning things out, that you have to write intuitively in the first draft. So, I mean, there's so many things that, I had no idea. In general, I know that things are working best when I don't know what's going to happen until the moment I write them, because that means that I'm really, I'm really sort of operating from inside my character. But yes, I mean, the book always was taking place in New York. I mean, it's very much about Morningside Heights, the neighborhood that Columbia is in. And so it's a city novel and a New York novel and an academic novel in certain ways. But at the same time, I certainly am not going to quibble with the New York Times review. It was such a flattering review by a great writer herself. And I do think New York is a big component of the book. But I think that any good novel is always about the particular. And if you get the particulars right, then it feels general and it feels bigger than it is. So I just think that a novelist has to take place seriously, whether it's New York or Dubuque or Des Moines or Sacramento or Hong Kong or, wherever, or a fictional location. That, in some books more than others, place as a character, and I'd certainly say in Morningside Heights, place as a character. But at the same time, I've read many novels where place is a character and place is really vivid, and I don't know that place, but I feel like I get to know the place by reading the book. So I guess I wasn't saying you're saying this, but I'm resistant to the idea that this is a book for New Yorkers. I think it takes place in New York, and New York is important to the characters and to the book. But I don't feel like you need to know New York, like New York, hate New York, whatever you relate to New York.
Right.
I don't think that has an impact on how one relates to the book. I would say, and I think that it's true, is that so I grew up. I'm 57. I was born in 1964, and I grew up in Manhattan on the Upper West Side in Morningside Heights, and I was there from 1964 to 1982. And then between 1982 and 1999, I lived in basically a series of college towns. I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I lived in Berkeley, California. I lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And then I came back and moved in with my then girlfriend, now wife, and we live in Brooklyn. So that's my geographic history. But
similar to Arlo's, I might add.
Yeah, Arlo's lived in more places than I have. So I say all that because I've watched New York change in ways good and in ways bad. I mean, the city has gentrified again in ways good and in ways bad. And this may be, the nuances may be particularly relevant for people who know New York well, but I grew up at a time, so I grew up in Morningside Heights, but I went to a small Jewish private school on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Now, I grew up at a time when there were really meaningful differences between the Upper West Side and the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Like, I was the poor, relatively poor, kid of an academic among kids who were upwardly mobile professionals. Now, in 2020, there are differences between the Upper West Side and the Upper East Side, but they're much more nuanced. So I think what I was doing, but again, this was subconscious. I mean, I'll digress for a moment and say that a friend of mine in college wrote her psychology thesis on how adults group objects versus how kids group objects. And the adults group the apple with a banana, and kids group the monkey with a banana. And that's a way of saying that kids are more natural storytellers than adults are. Teach myself to think like a child again, albeit like a smart, sophisticated child. So all these things I'm saying were not conscious on my part. I was just trying to write a story and make characters jump off the page. But I think, things come in through the back door. So I think one thing that the reviewer at times is pointing out that came in through the back door is that as I was writing about characters who change, and in some ways a character who declines, namely Spence, I was also in the process writing about a neighborhood that changes, a city that changes, a city that in some ways you could argue as to whether it improves or declines. I think there are ways in which it does both. But I think that there was a way in which New York was an important backdrop that was reflecting what the characters were doing. But this was not a conscious decision. I really have blinders on when I write. And so I was writing about characters who live in New York and know New York well. And so New York becomes important in that regard.
Yeah. I love what you said about if you get the particulars right, they become general. And there was another line that just is coming to me. I think maybe you were talking about North Carolina because that's where Rafe moves, but you said it's like you used a descriptor that is so accurate as I'm here in Virginia in the dog days of summer, and you said something like the weather feels like the inside of a dog's mouth during the summer, and I was like, yes, that is the best description of humid southern temperature. So I guess I share that because you're right. I mean, you don't have to be from New York or know New York to be enmeshed in this story, because if you tell the particulars right and you do a good job, it applies to everyone. So that is a really good answer, for lack of a better term. So another thing that I thought was really interesting, and I'll give a little bit of context for folks that haven't finished the book or read the book. So there's Spence, who's this brilliant professor, MacArthur Grant winner, and he has a stepson, Arlo, who's also very successful, but they have different markers of success, and they have very different understandings of ambition. And that seems to be, from my perspective, at odds throughout the book. And I'm curious if you think, and maybe you'll share a similar answer, it wasn't conscious, but if that is, a generational difference, a circumstantial difference, or innate difference, or maybe it's not a difference at all. But I did find those two tracks really interesting.
You're talking about Spencer's conception of success versus Arlo's conception of success?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I do think, I tend to write about characters who are overeducated and ambitious. And I do think that success and different conceptions of success are really important to the book, though again, I wasn't looking at it with a broad lens, I was looking at the narrow lens, but through my characters. So, and I guess I would start with Prue as someone who, she grew up in Ohio and went to Yale and then came to New York to do theater and then started a PhD program in English literature, and then meets Spence and drops out. And really, her life course changes as a result of that. But I see her as someone who was very successful in her own right, and then who got married to a famous professor and kind of clipped her own ambitions and hitched her wagon to his star. And so for me, one of the big things in the book is that it's kind of about vicarious success, by which I mean that, Prue really sees Spence's success as her own. She really identifies with his acclaim. And I'm interested in what happens when a spouse, in this case a wife, identifies really strongly with her husband's star power and what happens to her when that star fades. In some ways, I was much more interested in what happens to her when he declines it, what happens to him. Now, in terms of sort of Spence and Arlo, I mean, I think Spence is a tough dad to have. He's someone for whom academic success came very naturally, very easily, and he also has a pretty narrow sense of what's worthwhile. Like what's worthwhile for him is getting a PhD in the humanities. So I think that one of the real struggles between him and Arlo, when Arlo comes to live with him for those 2 years, when Arlo's a teenager, because for much of the time Arlo's moving around the country with his hippie mother, who wants to poop in all 50 states.
I love that.
So Arlo is not raised in Spence's home aside from those 2 years, and they really butt heads because Spence just thinks that his kids should succeed on Spence's terms. And Arlo is dyslexic and can't succeed on Spence's terms. And, Spence just thinks if only Arlo would study for the SAT, all would be well in the world. But Spence is obtuse about that. And Arlo is in fact very intelligent, and he becomes very successful, but just not in the way that his father wants it to be. And I think that, that Arlo's so Arlo becomes very wealthy in the tech industry. That's not too much of a spoiler. But I think part of Arlo's motivation is he both wants to be successful Arlo's relationship to his father is one where he's incredibly needy of his father's love, but also incredibly angry. And that comes out in various ways in the book. And, Arlo, Spence is very contemptuous of money and of things physical. He's kind of a guy who wishes he didn't have a body. And Spence understands that you need money in order to live, but the accrual of wealth does not interest Spence. And I think that's part of the reason it does interest Arlo, is that he's both going to succeed and say screw you to his father in the same way. So, Spence is a guy who says to the dean of the business school, you mean you can go to school for that? And Arlo's attitude toward his father is probably like, these PhDs in humanities write a book that 40 people in the world read, and this makes them famous. So I do think that they have very different definitions of success.
Yeah.
Are they generational? They may to some extent be Spence would say, unfortunately, they're generational.
Yeah.
Which he would mean that, people, his generation was interested in learning for learning's sake, and the new generation just wants to make money. I'm not sure that Spence's perspective is the only perspective on that, and things are much more complicated. But I would say more than it being generational, it has to just do with who these two particular characters are and what their temperaments are like. And, Arlo can't succeed on his father's terms, but he wants to succeed in a way where he feels that his father, where he can beat his father. This is his way of doing it.
Yeah. Certainly their temperament with each other plays a huge role in the path that that Arlo goes down, and it's just interesting to see the two and how vastly different they are. Okay, so I want to end with a few fun questions, but I also always like to ask authors that we chat with this question because it's an important one. I know we chatted yesterday briefly, and you mentioned that you often join book clubs and join their discussion. And I wanted to know what makes this a great book club book, or maybe even a better question is, how have some of those experiences shaped you as a writer? Is it an opportunity to connect so directly with your readers, a helpful part of the process, or maybe even more simply, it just leaves a lasting memory with you?
Yeah, well, so I've talked to a lot of book clubs for all of my books. And it's really, to me, one of the great pleasures of publishing a book is talking to book clubs. When I was a toddler, my mother says that when I was a toddler, when we were walking on the Upper West Side down Broadway, I would insist on being picked up, and I had to look into every window of every store. And I think that's my temperament, and that's the temperament of a fiction writer. You're endlessly curious. And I think if you're that way, you're endlessly curious about your readers. It's an honor and pleasure to be invited into someone's home. But then I think beyond that, I think, I spend a lot of my time talking about fiction with my graduate students at Brooklyn College. And, we get about 300 applicants a year for 15 spots, so it's very hard to get in. And I'm talking every week to some of the most talented young writers in the country. And these are people for whom writing and reading is their life. And that has its own pleasure. But I also feel like there's a different kind of pleasure in talking to people for whom reading isn't their whole life, but for whom reading is an important enough part that once a month they'll read a book and get together with friends and talk about it. And I think it's easy when you're in an ivory tower to sort of forget about the world out there, world of readers out there. In some ways, I'm much more interested in what the average reader is like in terms of how they think about books, and the chance to talk about fiction and about reading and about writing with people who aren't MFA students is a real opportunity and pleasure. So yeah, I love to talk to book group
Yeah, I bet that is a very, very different experience.
in the best way.
Yeah, and to be an author in that room would probably be very meaningful. And so with that, I should share, Joshua, you are open to joining book clubs if they are discussing your book, not just Morningside Heights, but I imagine any of your books. So we'll be happy to help facilitate that. But
and people can get on my website, and there's ways to contact me there too. So and
yeah, that's probably the best.
I'm very easy to reach.
Awesome. All right. Well, Joshua, we have, I've got just 4 questions for you, rapid fire. We like to end our interviews with these. They're fun, they're light, and we get to know a little bit more about you, not just as a writer, but as Joshua. So I have to ask, what book is currently on your nightstand?
So I have 2 books on my nightstand. One is the advanced reader's copy of a memoir called Tasha by Brian Morton, who's a wonderful novelist who wrote probably the book he's best known for is called Starting Out in the Evening. And it's a memoir about his mother's decline and about the way that his mother exasperated him, but also loved him. And it's a very moving book. And then I'm also reading a novel by Laurie Colwin, whom I'd never read before, but I've always meant to read. And a lot of people compare my work to hers, so I just wanted to read her. And so I'm reading a novel, Shine On, Bright and Dangerous Object. So those are 2 novels that are on my nightstand. So.
Awesome. This is always a fun one. So in a world in which Morningside Heights goes to the big screen, who would you want to play Prue?
So, it's funny, I've thought about that question because my last novel, The World Without You, was turned into a movie with a bunch of great actors. So these things aren't so theoretical. So for Prue, there are a number of possibilities. I think Laura Linney, maybe. No.
Yeah, she would be phenomenal as Prue.
Yeah.
I was thinking, one that came to mind for me was Julianne Moore, and I don't know if it's because we were talking yesterday about kind of the parallels between this story and Still Alice, which she is the protagonist in. But
right, she would be great, but it would be weird to have her do 2.
Yeah.
I mean, she'd be playing a very different role, but anyhow, yeah, she would be great too.
Yeah. Okay, and last question. For those that are familiar with New York, or
I thought you were going to ask about Arlo also.
Oh yeah, Arlo, of course. Sorry.
Yeah. No. So he may have become too much of a big movie star at this point, but someone like Timothée Chalamet feels like.
Oh yeah.
So anyhow.
He definitely, Timothée Chalamet definitely has that angsty teen thing going. Like he can really channel that, and then he's really good at that transformation. That's a great one. I hadn't thought about who I would choose for Arlo, and now I can't think of anyone else because it's like that's so on the nose. Okay, so the question for those that have been to New York or will visit someday, where do you recommend they go for breakfast? Breakfast spot in New York.
See, I'm in search of a breakfast spot now. So first of all, everyone has moved from Manhattan to Brooklyn. Certainly every writer has moved to Brooklyn. So I mean, not that I don't know Manhattan, and my wife teaches at Barnard, and my mom still lives in Morningside Heights, and my brother lives in Morningside Heights. So it's not like I don't know Manhattan. I spend a lot of time downtown in Manhattan. But Brooklyn is my place these days. And I used to go to this place called Rosewater in Park Slope for brunch or breakfast, but I closed down a year ago. So I'm still a Rosewater guy, and I'm waiting for, I mean, there are some other places I've been, obviously, but I'm still waiting for a new favorite spot. So anyhow.
Well, I the one place that I think I missed the most, I got to live right. Have you been to Kosars? On Essex. It's a bagel shop. It's delightful.
Okay.
So check that out next time you're in Manhattan.
I will.
All right. Well, Joshua, you've given us your time today, and it's been a delight. And for those of you who have not read Morningside Heights, I couldn't recommend it more. It's a wonderful experience and journey, and you'll fall in love with the characters for certain. So thank you, Joshua, so much. And
really enjoyed it.
We'll have this video saved for those that want to return to the interview.
Good. Okay. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.